Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate Center. Welcome to Women, a series of programs for and about us. I'm delighted a woman of great accomplishment is able to be with us today to tell us about one of her heroines, the subject of her latest book, Obsessive Genius, The Inner World of Marie Curie. Dr. Curie, the winner of 2 Nobel Prizes, and known to many of us as the co-discoverer of radium. But she was and accomplished much more, even if that would have been more than enough. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
The last time you were on this program, we were talking about your book about Victoria Woodhull.
That's right.
A very interesting, strong woman. And here now you've gone and done it again and chosen Marie Curie. What drew you to her?
I beg your pardon?
What drew you to her?
Oh, well, I have a friend, Robert Darnton, who's a professor at Princeton, and he happened to mention in passing that the Marie Curie papers, which were sealed for 70 years, had come into the public domain. And that's sort of catnip to me. I just thought, I must see these. So both Paul Leclerc and Bob Darnton went to work and wrote me wonderful letters of recommendation, and off I went to see them. That's the nutshell version. It wasn't that easy. When I got there, they still didn't want to let me see them because they said, although they were in the public domain, I needed a letter from a direct Curie relative in order to see them. And the next day I asked Madame Curie's, and we should call her Dr. Curie, right? What is this Madame Curie? You know, everybody else, her husband was Dr. Pierre Curie, and everyone on the Nobel Committee was Dr. this and Madame Curie. But anyway, I digress. I asked her to give me a note saying I could read them. She said, "That's ridiculous, they're in the public domain." So I thought for a minute, and I asked her to give me a note saying I didn't need a note, and I was off and running.
Why were they sealed for 70 years, do you think?
I think there were 2 reasons. One was that her daughter, Eve Curie, had written a brilliant biography of her mother shortly after her mother's death in 1934, and she really took what she wanted of these papers. There were certain papers that were quite scandalous. Marie had, if you read Obsessive Genius, an affair with a married physicist, and I don't think her daughter wanted that in the public. But even more compelling was the fact that a lot of these papers are radioactive. And so if you wanted to see any Curie paper for many, many years, even in the laboratory, you had to sign a medical release. And her granddaughter, Hélène Langevin-Joyaux, who is a wonderful physicist herself, took these to Orsay and in a 3-year period had them decontaminated, and then they were released.
And so you did not have to wear any protective gloves or anything when you looked at this?
Although maybe there were some traces of radioactivity, because if you run a Geiger counter over some of her papers, you hear the tick-a-tick-a-tick.
Interesting. Interesting.
There are traces of radiation.
She had a difficult childhood. She grew up in Poland. Her mother was ill with tuberculosis. Her father was politically not always welcome in his own profession of teaching, and yet she had a wonderful education.
She was remarkable. When I wrote Obsessive Genius, I had bought the story of the idol. She was my childhood idol, and I never realized that she wasn't French, that she was Polish. And at that time, Poland didn't even exist. They had expunged it from the maps, and they called it the Vistula, after the river. And Russia was in charge of Warsaw, where she was born. And she had to speak Russian, she had to go to school in Russian, And she was a star pupil, but her father was a great Polish patriot and tried to keep Polish patriotism alive in his family. And one of the things that I loved in one of the letters that revealed this amazing story that I didn't know existed was that when she was about 60, someone asked her to translate something from Russian to French. And she said, "Why are you asking me? I know nothing of that hateful language." She had blocked it totally.
But science was part of her growing up, and that was unusual.
Not unusual in the fact that her father was a physicist. He was fired because of his political views. In Obsessive Genius, you'll read the opening scene where she's standing in front of a case where he has all his physics equipment, and it fascinates her. And then, all through her childhood, as you mentioned, her mother had tuberculosis, couldn't go near her own children, used her own utensils. So the father was the pivotal figure, and he gave her science problems from the time she was little. She said that every walk was a lesson in nature or science, that every time she looked at the stars, he'd try to explain to her the concept of another dimension of space. And so she had very positive reinforcement and no discouragement about being a fantastic scientist. Her brother became a scientist. Her sister became a doctor.
But you know, it's interesting because the typical story is that a father like that would have favored the son, and the daughters would not have been included. So he was a very unusual man for his time, to treat his daughters in the same way he treated his son, as committed to educating them as he was to the son.
Well, he was part of a class of Polish people who had once been aristocracy. They'd lost their land, but they'd kept their intellect. But, you know, even he favored the son because he paid for the son's education, as poor as he was. And Marie Curie, Mania Sladowska, had to work 8 years as a governess to put her sister through school. And then when her sister began to earn a little money, she sent for Marie and brought her to the Sorbonne. So even though he was so encouraging, and even though his daughter, Mania Marie, was first in the class at all times, he wouldn't pay for her education. He paid for the son's education.
That's interesting. But when she got to Paris, did things get easier?
Well, the Sorbonne is free, and she lived in a fifth-floor garret. She barely had enough to eat. She, you know, if she had an apple or a scuttle of coal, that was a big treat for her. But she wrote that those were the happiest days of her life, that she was free to pursue what was in her head, and she never felt deprived in any way.
Reading this and visualizing the scenes, it occurred to me Puccini might well have written about Madame Curie rather than La Bohème,
Yes.
because the same set of dynamics of poverty, of deep commitment to your craft, and she really lived in very deprived conditions for so many years.
Yes, she did. And money was always a concern, and it was usually money for more research, not money for any personal reason. She lived very simply for the very beginning of her life, and when she married Pierre Curie, they spent whatever extra money they had on bicycles, and that was their honeymoon. They took a 2-month bicycle trip.
You know, reading this, the thread of the story of her life is in many ways fashioned by strong men. Her father, her husband, and her father-in-law, all of whom, in their way, supported her and cared that she would be part of this achievement.
I think the key word in what you said is support. They were outside of the social milieu of the time, which was that women were weaker, women didn't have the same aptitudes, and so she never had to face that. She never had to face that sort of garbagey talk that everybody talked. She did, when she won her Nobel Prize, they put him on the podium and her in the audience, but in a way it worked for her, because then he in his speech said, I had nothing to do with these studies of radioactivity. This was my wife and I was her assistant. And so she had supportive men. And so I think that for women, no matter whether they're a genius or not, it's support that encourages them. You know, they reach when they're supported. They feel, I can do it. They're the little engine that could. When they're not supported, then we see it all the time in science. There's a wonderful little book called Talking About Leaving. And these women talk about why they left the sciences. And it's always crucial that they had no support, no mentors, no people who believed in them. And Marie was very lucky. You're absolutely right. Not only did her father-in-law believe in her, he took care of the family.
Yes, he moved in with them. I mean,
yes.
When you think of the time that her father-in-law would move in with them and essentially raise her daughters.
He did that, yes. And there was never a problem until he died. And then she had massive problems. Her husband died, her father-in-law died, and there she was, a single mother with 2 little girls and not enough money, and only wanting really to get back to that laboratory.
But you know, when you talk about how important support is, the same thing is true for men. In science or in any field, the difference is the probability of their being supported is so much higher in most situations than the probability that the women will get the support.
Yes, MIT did a 5-year study before the president came in, and it was that men are often seated in the front of the class, women are in the back. Men are called upon and may not be called upon only when they don't know the answer and some woman in the back of the room raises her hand. They come out now almost at the same level, but if you extrapolate 10 to 12 years, they're way behind the curve. They don't get the equal salary, they don't get tenure, they don't have the same laboratory equipment, and on and on and on. And I certainly hope that that will change. I see it is changing because now it's an issue of public debate.
It surely is.
Once there's an issue of public debate and that spotlight goes on, things begin to change. And it's about time.
Marie Curie, Dr. Curie, is mainly known in the public mind as the discoverer of radium. But in fact, she discovered polonium, which she named after Poland. And in fact, her second Nobel Prize had to do with her ability, her discovery of the way in which you could identify things by the level of radioactivity. How much physics did you have to learn, or did you know to write this book?
No. I'm a total autodidact. I must say that I had many people who would read what I'd written and I'd say, is this right? Is it accurate? And the hardest thing was to boil it down so that it was understandable. My grandson, who's 14, can understand every bit of the science in that. And that was what was hard. Not for me to grasp it, but for me to put it in simple English declarative sentences so that everybody could know.
That you did. I mean, it is a marvelous read, and it also teaches you a lot about the physics of what Marie Curie was involved in.
Absolutely, and you understand now, I think, the partnership between Marie and Pierre, because she found radioactivity's uses, what these strange Becquerel rays were and what they could be used for. For example, France used to import 90% of its energy. Now, because of Marie's discoveries, they manufacture 90% of their energy. But Pierre designed the equipment that made this possible. Nobody could have measured those tiny little rays unless he had designed this electrometer that was so sensitive. And of course, when you look at it now, it looks like a Rube Goldberg.
Right.
You know, it's this contraption of wires and plywood and glue, same kind of thing that the great English scientist Ernest Rutherford worked with. I mean, when he made the first radio receiver, he took a wooden spool and stuck straight pins in it, and that was the first radio receiver.
You know, what I had not realized about Dr. Curie, though I'd known a lot about her life, was how driven both she and her husband were to study these things for their medical applications and for improving people's health and health care. I think that one thinks of her more as this pure scientist without any interest in applications, but in fact they were really driven by interest in applications.
Yes, they were. And a common conception is that radium was the great cure-all. But indeed, it was a twin-edged sword, because as you see in Obsessive Genius, she died of overexposure. Her daughter died of overexposure. Her daughter also won a Nobel Prize.
Right.
And it's, for example, in New Jersey, there were 35 girls who painted the numbers on watch dials because radium glows in the dark. And they would lick the brushes to bring them to a perfect point. And all 35 of them died of throat or neck cancer. And radium was only used for 20 years in cancer treatment, and then it was replaced by cobalt. And the sophisticated methods they use today have nothing to do with radium. But all those words, radiology, you know, it sticks in your head.
Right.
Yeah.
But, you know, a parallel to this amazing scientific career was her personal odyssey, and marked by periods and maybe chronic deep depression. Was that well known when you started this book, or is that what came out of the work that you did?
That came out of the work that I did, because that was another thing that particularly her daughter had said, skirted around. But when you read the papers, you see that she was non-functional when Hertha Atron took care of her for over a year. 14 months she didn't see anyone with the blinds pulled down. And it started in childhood. Her mother died of tuberculosis, and then her favorite sister died of typhus, I'd say 4 months later. And she was the youngest of the children, this little girl wearing her sister's coat, following the cortege to the cemetery. And after that, she would hide under the stairs and not come out. And every time there was this enormous stress, because her father, in addition to being supportive, drove her. I mean, her teacher said, you know, she has a very febrile personality. Maybe you should give her a little time off. What he did was put her in a harder school instead of listening to the teachers. And she would have these periodic total breakdowns. And today, I've consulted a lot of psychiatrists on this. We would call her a bipolar personality.
The hero again, I think is her father-in-law, who so uncharacteristic for that time, moved in, helped raise those children, and the stability of those children must have rested on that relationship that they had with him.
Absolutely, because in the letters I have in here from, she writes about her daughter and how the grandfather is the only stable thing, and that how when he dies, she's even more upset than when her father died. And of course, Marie Curie had perhaps the least psychological understanding of these two daughters. She said, Irene really that doesn't care too much that her father has died. However, she won't come out of her room and she asks for a picture of him. Mm. Well, you know, what is that? Right. It was not Marie's way of mourning. It was Irene's way of mourning, but she didn't understand it. She didn't understand that it was unusual to take an 18-year-old, drop her on the front lines with some X-ray equipment and say, teach these doctors how to do this.
But she did.
But she did. They always rose to the challenge.
Right. So Irene became a physicist, and the other daughter?
Eve, who was the rebel. She could have been a concert pianist, but she was very discouraged by her mother, who called it noise. Can I live with this noise, she used to say. She was a very fine journalist, and eventually she married Henri Labouisse, who was the head of UNICEF, and he won a Nobel Prize.
What a family story.
Yes.
What a family story. But now one of the granddaughters has become a physicist also?
The granddaughter is, I would say, perhaps the most respected physicist in France, and she's the head of the university at Orsay, and she is just retiring. She's in her 70s now. But Eve, the daughter, who helped me with this book, is still alive. She's 101 now, and as sharp and focused as she possibly could be. She's just a remarkable woman.
Well, the publication of this book could not be more timely, given the current controversy about women in science. What lessons do you draw from this besides the issue of support?
I think that it is very important for people to have a level playing field. And I've been staying away from mentioning names or doing anything like that, but I think what Larry Summers did in his statement that perhaps there's a genetic difference that makes women inferior, well, you know, if you study these things as I have done, and you have done particularly, you find that with men, there's a great variance. Some of them are brilliant in science, and some are really dumb in science. And nobody says this is genetic. Maybe 100 years from now, they'll pin down exactly what the genetic differences are. But you know what? It couldn't matter less. What matters is giving someone an equal deal, a square deal, letting them have a mentor, take some interest in them when they're students, letting them have equal say in the class, giving them the same equipment so they can pursue their studies. I have a friend who's a professor who wrote an article about a mentor who, when his female student got too good, tried to lock her out of the laboratory. If you read Obsessive Genius, you'll see that Gabrielle Lippmann, who was Marie's mentor when she began to deal with radioactivity and be a real contender for the Nobel Prize, he said she hadn't anything to do with it. It was her husband and Becquerel that should get the prize. She shouldn't get the prize. We have to erase these ingrown things. And I think probably what was most destructive about what Larry Summers said was the fact that he didn't even know that it was a destructive thing to say. He didn't even know. He said, oh, I'm just putting this issue on the table. Well, it's just like saying, I'm just locking her out of the lab because that kind of interests me what her reaction will be. It's really terribly damaging. And as a college president, I'd be very interested in what you think about it, because it's not within the realm of what a college president should be doing. All of these things need redressing, and he should be up there redressing these issues, saying, we're going to support women. We're going to give them tenure if they qualify. We're not going to talk about pregnancies and what are they going to do with their children and how can you work 80 hours a week and have children. We're going to put a nursery in or pay for preschool. That's what we're going to do. It's ridiculous now. You tell me.
Well, we're just about out of time. Let me just say that it is a very complex set of issues. I like to say as a developmental psychologist that we should hurry up and discover the gene for everything, and then we'll understand how little of the variance it accounts for in human behavior, and that the only purely genetic moment in our life journeys is the moment of conception. Past conception, everything is an interaction. And when you consider the data that show how cumulatively, systematically, and subtly young girls and then women are given messages about their capabilities, about their acceptance, about their role. I mean, it has been well known that 2 children in a class with women teachers and men teachers, one a girl, one a boy, the boy is more likely to be called on. When you accumulate that over years and years of experience, it has its effect, a subtle effect, but a definite effect, and accumulates over time. But, Barbara, you have written a marvelous book, and we could talk many more hours, but I'm sorry we're out of time. My thanks to Barbara Goldsmith for joining us. Obsessive Genius, The Inner World of Marie Curie, the latest in the Great Discovery series published by Atlas Books, division of W.W. Norton and Company. For the City University Graduate Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.